My name is Virginia Kime Brooks. I go by Ginny.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. And what years were you here at YDS?
I was at YDS from 1966 through graduating in 1969.
When you were looking at grad schools or divinity schools, why did you pick YDS?
I chose YDS largely because some of my college professors recommended it. I went to college out in Ohio, and I'm Presbyterian, and I had a full scholarship to the Presbyterian Seminary in Pittsburgh, and my family had lived in Pittsburgh. I grew up in that area, so I think for my parents that was a natural. But I got into YDS, and I had these professors urging me to spread my wings and come east. And even though I didn't have scholarship help here, my parents supported my decision, and I was able to come to YDS.
Did you go to Worcester?
I did.
I had a lot of Presbyterian friends.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was wonderful. About what percentage of your class were women?
I think about 10%. There were approximately 30 of us in Porter Hall, the women's dorm, and we always were told there were 300 men. I think that included grad students as well, in the PhD program as well.
Did you experience YDS as a male-dominated environment?
Definitely, but it wasn't as maybe negative as that sounds. I particularly remember most of the professors, if not all, virtually all, were men, but they never treated us as second-class citizens. They always assumed we were here, we were competent, we could do the work. So, but it was jarring after a fully co-ed college experience to come, say, walk into a dining hall with all those men. And it took a while to make good female friends, even though we were a small group, to really find sort of those that you felt comfortable with.
Oh, one little thing we forgot to mention. I don't think you mentioned it to her about the questions and the answer.
Full sentences?
Yes.
Yes.
So, if possible.
To try to allude to what I'm talking to,
yes.
Yes.
They won't hear her question.
Right.
We do that every time people start out the way they're supposed to, and then they drift.
Yeah,
right,
then we
right.
lapse into okay.
Jenny, tell me again what you were commenting on when you sat down about the not getting to know the wives of the students. And
yes. It was a very male-dominated environment, and I think we as women often felt isolated. We were all living in Porter Hall, and there were only about 30 of us. But there were all these women next door in what we called the Fertile Crescent. That's where the couples lived. But many of those women were working to support their husbands through seminary. A lot of them were professionals, teachers, nurses, and so forth. But the only times we ever connected with them were on, sort of formal social occasions. And most of those men did not eat in the refectories. So we didn't get to know that part of our class very well or their female spouses.
That's too bad, really, in retrospect.
Yes.
Were there women role models, either faculty or staff here?
Women role models. I think that was, looking back, one of the big gaps that we felt it at the time. I think the only full professor when I was here was Iris Cully, and she was in Christian education, which of course was a traditional role for women. Portia Bowers was here. She coordinated, I don't know what her title was, but she coordinated the field work. And we learned during the planning meetings that she's passed away, but all of us remember her well. She organized the practicums that went along with our field work. She was incredibly organized. We all admired her energy, but she wasn't really on the faculty. And the other woman I remember particularly was Margaret Farley, who later became a professor here, but she was actually a PhD student at the time. But my then he wasn't my husband then, but my classmate Ed Brooks, whom I later married, we both had a course with Margaret. It was taught by Professor David Little on the ethics of Calvinism, and it was fascinating to have Margaret as a classmate, a peer, even at the time. And she was still wearing her habit then. You know, it was very, and there weren't that many Catholics as students or faculty at the time, but she was, bright as she was and able, she just was very humble in the classroom, just like any of us, but what a joy to get to know her. And I'm so glad to see her portrait now in the common room. There were no women on the walls then.
I'm very glad to hear those stories about Margaret.
Yes.
Back in the day.
Yes.
You kind of mentioned social challenges, what I would consider social challenges as a woman here. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes. The social environment, it was not very natural, of course, with that odd ratio of so many men and a few women. I do remember the men looked to us to organize social events, and we did have some mixers. My husband loves to tell the story that he came to the first mixer at Porter Hall with a friend, and he claims that I hardly noticed him. I spent that whole evening interacting with his friend. I hardly have a memory of the event at all, but we used to have, you know, mixers there, and we would try to invite the men for birthday parties and things. But they also, I can remember some fun parties on the quad that they were in houses, smaller groups, Bacon, Bushnell, Hopkins, and so forth, and they would have parties on the weekends too. So, and the best part, I think, was socially was meeting, just the informal meeting people in the refectory over lunch or dinner, and then a lot of us would settle in the common room afterwards. I remember playing bridge there, and we had a couple men in the class who were wonderful on the piano. One of them played yesterday at our memorial service, Dick Coleman, yes. And we would gather around the piano and have a lot of fun singing. So there were relaxed, informal times together. And of course there was downtown, the whole university. I remember going to Glee Club concerts, and there were opportunities downtown. But again, as women, we had very little contact with women in the graduate schools. I do remember going with a friend from Porter Hall to some kind of a gathering hosted by women in the graduate schools, and it was fun to see that there were, but there was not any easy time to connect with them, you know, given the distance.
Mm. What did you do after you left?
Well, as I mentioned before, when we left, I met my husband. We were married here at YDS. We were married a week before we graduated. He had been in the Peace Corps in India for 2 years before coming to YDS, and he always jokes that I helped him get over his culture shock on returning to the States. But he had taught at a boarding school in India and was determined when he came back to be a teacher of religion. And there aren't that many opportunities. I guess today there are some schools, public schools now, where you can teach the academic study of religion. And I, of course, was always interested, even when I knew when I came to YDS I wanted to seek the full degree, the BD, and be ordained, probably to a teaching ministry, maybe through the church, because there were probably more options there. But anyway, I was certainly open to looking at boarding schools where he thought there'd be the most opportunity for teaching religion. And we luckily, I still laugh now, everybody finds their jobs online or their opportunities. Back then there was a bulletin board in the hallway with little yellow or tannish 3x5 cards where you would look for job openings. And one day Northfield School for Girls was looking for they had a position and a half open in religious studies, so we leaped at the chance. It's up the River Valley, Connecticut River Valley in Western Mass, and we got the jobs there. Of course, I took the half-time position. Ed kept telling me, "You don't really have to work," and I said, "But I want to work. I've got my degree." But within a semester, I was full-time too, and that's where we spent our careers.
The whole time.
36 years together. So it was a great fit for both of us. I ended up I really thrived on administrative work, so I served a number of terms as head of the religious studies department, and he loved the teaching, and we also had about a dozen years as co-chaplains at the school, so it worked out to be a good match for us.
Lucky them. Would you like to share a memory you have of your time here, a particular, any kind of memory?
Yes, a memory of my time at YDS. There's so many, but I think some that I cherish the most are the connections with faculty. One of the great friends my husband and I both made at YDS was Sib Towner. He was the professor of Old Testament when we arrived. We were both, as many of our classmates were in the entering class, we took the Introduction to Old Testament with Sib Towner. And even though I had taken college religion courses and had some background, I still remember the first day. Sib opened that class and every class with a beautiful prayer. And it was a surprise, but then it seemed appropriate. You're training folks for the ministry. But his prayers were so inspiring. They were short, succinct, but I would call them lyrical. They were almost poetic. And we all looked forward. You were never late because you didn't want to miss the prayer. And we stayed in touch. Sib Towner officiated at our wedding in Marquand Chapel, and we stayed in touch with him over the years. I think it was in our last year here, one of the things I noticed in the memory book other people alluded to was we fought to try to get tenure for Sib Towner. He was coming up for tenure. I believe it was our last year, 68, 69. He didn't get tenure, but he did at least, he was on the faculty a couple more years after we left. But he went out to he was dean at Dubuque, and he spent the bulk of his years at Union Seminary in Virginia. So in 2013, we bought a new car and headed south just to put some miles on, and we were retired by then. And on the way home, we contacted Sib and his wife, Jane, who, interestingly enough, was in our class. She had taken courses over the years while Sib was teaching. They were raising two young daughters then. And I remember having a class with George Lindbeck where we were both in that class together. Anyway, coming back up to our home in New Hampshire, we stopped to see the Towners. Sib, he had Parkinson's at the end. I think it was just the onset. He was still fully in control of his faculties, and we met for lunch at a restaurant and took some photos. At the time, he said that people had told him they wished he would publish his prayers. And he said, I think that might finally happen. He said, I have some students at Union Seminary who want to help me do this. So we sent a Christmas card last year to the Towners, and when we got back from visiting family over Christmas in January, there was a note from his widow, Jane, saying Sib passed away in May of 2018. But she had sent the note with the published book of prayers. They had gotten those published, and what a treasure that is for us, and to know that came to fruition. And I think there's some copies now people can buy in the bookstore here. We asked them to stock it for the reunion. There were other professors, of course, that I worked for Randolph Crump Miller. He edited a journal in Christian Ed, and I helped him. It was sort of my way to make pocket money. I worked in his office, which was so convenient, being right here on campus. So many others. I worked one summer for Sidney Alstrom when he was getting the manuscript ready for his book, and they were all up on a pedestal, but they always treated us with, they made it clear that they wanted to get to know you as a person as well as a student.
That was a wonderful thing about this place. Ginny, thank you so much.
Well,
this was wonderful.
I've enjoyed it, and the
memories.
opportunity to, I think those of us in our class can hardly believe we've been out 50 years, but how nice to know that a slice of our record will now be recorded.
And I'm very grateful to all of you for coming by.
Thank you so much.